Hey guys, tonight let's do something very calm, very old, very dusty. Go ahead and dim the lights. Put your phone face down. Let your shoulders drop a little. Tonight, we're drifting back to the very beginning of recorded history. Not with fireworks, not with epic battles, but with mud bricks, bored gods, tired kings, and a civilization that didn't explode so much as gently sigh itself out of existence. This is the quiet end of the Sumerians. And yes, these are those Sumerians, the ones who invented writing, and cities, and bureaucracy, which frankly should have been enough of a warning sign. Now, when people imagine the fall of ancient civilizations, they usually picture flames, screaming, barbarians at the gates, someone dramatically dropping a crown in slow motion. But the Sumerians didn't really go out like that. They faded. They blended. They paperworked themselves into irrelevance, which is honestly very on brand. So let's ease into it. The Sumerians lived in southern Mesopotamia, in what is now southern Iraq. Flat land, very flat. So flat that if you stood on a hill, people would assume you were either a god or extremely lost. There were no mountains, no forests, no natural defenses whatsoever, just rivers. The Tigris, the Euphrates. Rivers that flooded constantly, unpredictably, and with zero respect for human plans. And this is where the Sumerians decided to build the world's first cities, because of course they did. Cities like Uruk, Or, Lagash, Kish, names that sound like someone gently clearing their throat. These weren't cute little villages. These were full-on urban experiments. Temples, warehouses, apartment blocks, accounting offices. So much accounting. The Sumerians loved lists. They loved categories. They loved recording how many jars of barley someone owed the temple. Writing didn't begin as poetry. It began as receipts. And that really tells you everything you need to know about how this was going to end. Now, early on, things were actually going pretty well. The Sumerians figured out irrigation. They grew absurd amounts of grain. They had surplus. And surplus means specialization, which means priests, scribes, potters, brewers, and people whose entire job was to argue about land boundaries. They invented kingship, not because everyone wanted a king, but because someone had to coordinate flood control, temple offerings, and wars over irrigation canals. And once you invent kings, things start getting complicated. Sumerian kings weren't exactly glamorous. They were half religious administrator, half stressed-out project manager. Their job description was basically keep the gods happy, keep the canals working, try not to let the city starve. No pressure. The gods, by the way, were not chill. Sumerian religion was deeply pessimistic. The gods were powerful, moody, and largely uninterested in human happiness. Floods happened because the gods felt like it. Droughts happened because someone messed up a ritual. Disease happens because reasons. There was no moral logic, just vibes. Bad vibes. And so Sumerian life had this low-level anxiety baked into it, a constant sense that things could go wrong at any moment, which is relatable, honestly. Now, for a long time, Sumerian city-states fought each other constantly. Small wars, border disputes, canal sabotage, very petty stuff. But none of this destroyed them. They just kept rebuilding. Mud bricks dissolve. You make more mud bricks. That's Mesopotamian urban planning in a nutshell. The real problem wasn't a single invasion. It was exhaustion. Over centuries, the land itself started to turn against them. Irrigation, which had been their greatest strength, slowly poisoned the soil. Salts built up. Yields dropped. Barley replaced wheat because barley could tolerate salt better, which is not a sign of prosperity. It's a sign you're lowering your expectations. At the same time, the climate was shifting. Floods became harsher. Rainfall patterns changed. And the Sumerians, who had no mountains or forests to retreat into, just had to deal with it. So they did what humans always do. They prayed harder. They wrote longer complaints to the gods. There are surviving tablets where people basically say, "Hey, so this is not working. What did we do wrong?" The gods naturally did not respond. Meanwhile, new groups were moving in. Akkadians, Amorites, people with different languages and different gods. These weren't apocalyptic invasions. They were gradual infiltrations, intermarriage, trade, political takeovers that looked very polite on the surface. The Akkadian king Sargon eventually unified much of Mesopotamia, and for a while, Sumerian culture didn't disappear, it got absorbed. Sumerian became a scholarly language, like Latin later on, used by priests and scribes, not by regular people buying beer. And that's when you know a culture is quietly slipping away. No riots, no dramatic collapse, just fewer parents teaching their kids the old language. Cities kept running, temples stayed open, but the identity changed, and the Sumerians noticed. There's this pervasive sadness in late Sumerian texts, a sense of loss, of nostalgia for a past golden age that probably wasn't actually that great, but feels better in hindsight. Kings started styling themselves as restorers. We will bring back the old ways. We will please the gods like our ancestors did, which is historically the sound of a civilization struggling to stay relevant. The third dynasty of tried especially hard. They centralized administration, standardized laws, expanded bureaucracy to levels that would make modern governments nod in respect. It was impressive. It was also incredibly fragile, because when the system failed, it failed quietly. Grain shipments stopped arriving, officials falsified records to avoid blame, local governors acted independently, and slowly the center could no longer hold. By the time the Amorites took control, there was no dramatic end to the Sumerians. People still lived in the cities, they still farmed the land, they just didn't call themselves Sumerian anymore. Their gods were rebranded, their myths retold in new languages, their kings replaced by other kings who reused the same titles. It was cultural recycling at its finest. And somewhere, a Sumerian scribe etched one last tablet, recorded one last shipment of barley, and went home very tired. So this is where we'll pause for now. Not with a bang, not with a scream, just with a civilization slowly folding itself into history. In the next part, we'll drift deeper into the personal side of Mesopotamian decline, the kings who tried to hold everything together, the emotional meltdowns, the letters full of quiet panic. But for now, just let this moment sit. A flat land, a fading language, and a people who invented history only to become part of it. Take a slow breath. We'll continue drifting soon. All right. Let's just keep floating. If you're still awake, that's okay. If you're not, that's also fine. This is history designed to gently dissolve into the background of your thoughts. So, when we last drifted off, the Sumerians were still technically around. Their cities were standing, their temples were staffed, their gods were still being fed on schedule. But the feeling had changed, and you can really see that shift when you look at the kings, because Sumerian kings, especially late ones, had a very specific vibe. It was less divinely chosen ruler and more middle manager trying to stop the system from collapsing during a budget freeze. Let's ease into one of them. Ur-Nama. He was the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, around the late 22nd century BCE, and history remembers him kindly, which usually means he worked himself into the ground. Ur-Nama rebuilt temples, standardized weights and measures, issued one of the earliest known law codes, and these laws were surprisingly gentle. No dramatic Hammurabi-style eye for an eye chaos yet. More like fines, compensation, rules about not stealing oxen. This suggests something important. The society wasn't imploding violently, it was trying very hard to stay orderly. Ur-Nama presented himself as a restorer of balance, a man bringing back the good old days, which again is never a great sign. He also died in battle, which was awkward, because Sumerian kings were supposed to be divinely protected. The official explanation was that the gods had momentarily looked away. Very relatable. His son, Shulgi, took over, and Shulgi is fascinating in a very quiet, bureaucratic way. Shulgi ruled for nearly 50 years, which is an eternity in ancient politics, and he was obsessed with efficiency. He restructured the entire administrative system, created standardized scribal schools, set up road networks with rest stops. Rest stops in 2000 BCE. This man was inventing highway infrastructure while most of the world was still arguing with rocks. He also declared himself a god, which might sound arrogant, but in context it feels a bit desperate. Because if you're a god king, then surely the system won't fall apart, right? Right? Shulgi wrote hymns about himself, long ones, very flattering ones. He described his athletic prowess, his wisdom, his ability to run long distances, which historians politely interpret as propaganda, but which, if we're being honest, reads like someone trying to convince themselves they still have control. Behind the scenes, things were fraying. The economy depended heavily on centralized redistribution. Grain flowed into state storehouses, then back out to workers. As long as the harvests were good, this worked. When they weren't, the whole system stiffened. Officials became corrupt. Records stopped matching reality. People fled rural areas. And the king, surrounded by tablets insisting everything was fine, probably had a sense that it wasn't. After Shulgi, his successors had much shorter reigns, which is history's way of saying something's going wrong. Amar-Sin, Shu-Sin, Ibi-Sin. Each one tried to maintain the system, issued decrees, prayed harder, blamed local governors. Ibi-Sin, the last king, gets especially bleak. We have letters from this period, actual correspondence, and they are quietly heartbreaking. Governors write to the king saying things like, "The grain has not arrived. The people are starving. The Amorites are everywhere." The king responds with instructions, reassurances, promises, but the letters keep coming. Eventually, the capital city of Ur is cut off. Trade routes collapse. Food shortages intensify. And there's no big final battle described in epic poetry. Ur is simply abandoned. People leave. Temples fall silent. Administration stops. Ibi-Sin disappears from the record, which is about as quiet an ending as a king can have. Now, here's the thing. The Sumerians didn't vanish. They became something else. Their language survived in temples and schools. Their myths were copied, translated, and retold. The Epic of Gilgamesh, originally Sumerian. Later Akkadian scribes kept it alive, because good stories outlive their authors. Sumerian gods didn't die either. They were renamed, merged, rebranded. Inanna became Ishtar. Utu became Shamash. Same divine personalities, new labels, which honestly feels like corporate restructuring. And culturally, Sumerian ideas lived on everywhere. Law, kingship, urban planning, the idea that writing things down matters. Even the pessimism stuck. Mesopotamian literature never really becomes optimistic. It stays grounded, a little weary, very aware that humans are small and the universe does not care. And maybe that's the most Sumerian legacy of all. Because they didn't believe in glorious endings, they believed in continuity, in cycles, in decline followed by replacement. No apocalypse, just transition. And that's why their end feels so strange to modern audiences. We want collapses to be loud. We want ruins and conquest narratives. But the Sumerians slipped out the back door. Their descendants still farmed the land, still walked the same streets, still drank the same beer. They just spoke different words while doing it. So if you imagine a final Sumerian scribe sitting in a quiet schoolroom copying an old hymn into a new language, that's probably as close as we get to an ending. No fire, no screaming, just a slow, careful act of preservation. And with that image, we'll drift onward. In the next part, we'll linger with Sumerian daily life, the ordinary people, the tired workers, the children trained to press wedges into clay for hours at a time. Because civilizations don't end with kings. They end with people going to bed, planning to wake up, and never realizing they're in the last chapter. Just breathe. Let the rivers flow. We'll continue shortly. All right, let's keep drifting. No sudden movements, no big revelations, just the slow continuation of people living their lives while history quietly changes the labels on the map. Because when civilizations end, it's rarely the kings who feel it first. It's the regular people. And even then, they don't always notice right away. So let's settle into Sumerian daily life. Late Sumerian daily life. The kind that smells faintly of barley beer and wet clay. Most Sumerians were farmers, which means their entire existence revolved around the rivers. You woke up early, you checked the canals, you prayed they hadn't flooded overnight. You prayed they would flood later, but not too much. A very specific request. Homes were made of mud brick, single story, flat roofs. In the summer, people slept on those roofs to escape the heat, which meant entire neighborhoods just quietly breathing under the stars. It's peaceful, actually, until you remember the mosquitoes. Food was simple: bread, dates, onions, fish when available, and beer. So much beer. Sumerian beer was thick, unfiltered, basically fermented porridge. People drink it through straws to avoid the chunky bits, which is both clever and deeply unappetizing. But it worked. It was calories. It was hydration. It was safer than water half the time. Children grew up fast. They helped in the fields. They carried water. They learned trades. If a family had enough resources, a child might be sent to scribal school. This was not a fun experience. Scribal training was brutal, hours of copying signs, getting beaten for mistakes. We actually have tablets where students complain about their teachers. One says, essentially, "My teacher hit me because my handwriting was bad," which tells you that student burnout is at least 4,000 years old. But scribes were important. They kept the system running. And in late Sumerian society, scribes were probably feeling uneasy because they were the first to notice things weren't lining up. Records said the grain was there. Reality said it wasn't. Rations got smaller, delayed, sometimes skipped entirely. And when a bureaucratic system starts lying to itself, the people inside it feel that tension every day. Religion remained constant. Temples dominated city centers. Priests performed daily rituals. Offerings continued even during hardship, because if things were bad, that meant the gods were angry, and if the gods were angry, you definitely didn't stop feeding them. Festivals still happened. Music played. Hymns were sung. There's something very human about that, continuing traditions even when the future feels uncertain. Marriages happened too, often arranged, practical. Women in Sumer had more rights than you might expect. They could own property, run businesses, serve as priestesses. But their lives were still narrow. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was high. People grieved quietly. There was no concept of a blissful afterlife. The Sumerian underworld was bleak, dust, shadows, no reward. So grief was final, heavy. And as resources dwindled, stress crept into households. More disputes, more court cases over land and water, more tablets recording arguments that probably started over something small and spiraled. Now imagine being alive during this period. You don't think, I live at the end of Sumerian civilization. You think, this year was worse than last year. You think, the canals aren't working like they used to. You think, the officials are corrupt. You think, the gods are displeased. Which are thoughts humans have had forever. As Amorites' influence grew, things shifted gradually. New names appeared in records, new accents in the marketplace, new gods introduced alongside old ones. This wasn't invasion by sword, it was cultural blending. Your neighbor's kids spoke a different language. Your boss prayed to a god you didn't recognize. Life kept going. Sumerian stopped being spoken casually. Children learned Akkadian instead. Sumerian survived as a written language, formal, sacred. Which means, for a while, people spoke one language and wrote another. That disconnect is fascinating. It creates distance between tradition and reality. And slowly, Sumerian identity became something academic, something learned, not lived. And that's how cultures fade. Not erased, archived. The last Sumerians weren't dramatic figures. They were farmers, scribes, mothers, children. They worried about food, about floods, about whether the gods were listening. And then, one day, they were no longer Sumerian, not because anyone told them so, but because time moved on. Their stories remained, copied by others, retold with small changes. And that's what kept them alive. Not monuments, not empires. Words. So, as we drift into the next part, keep that in mind. Civilizations don't need endings, they just need successors. Next, we'll gently wander through Sumerian myths, the stories they told themselves about gods, kings, and inevitable loss. Because if you want to understand how a civilization felt about its own quiet end, you listen to the stories it left behind. Just let the clay tablet settle. We'll continue in a moment. All right, let's just keep floating along. No sharp turns, no sudden awakenings, just the gentle hum of very old stories being retold by people who already suspected that nothing lasts forever. Because if you want to understand the Sumerians, especially near the end, you don't look at their kings, you look at their myths. Sumerian mythology is not heroic in the way later traditions are. There's no grand promise that good will triumph, no clear moral arc. It's more like, yes, this is how the world is. No, it will not get better. Please manage your expectations, which, honestly, is kind of refreshing. The gods themselves were deeply flawed, moody, petty, easily offended. They created humans not out of love, but convenience. Humans were made to do the labor the gods didn't want to do anymore. Dig canals, grow food, maintain temples. You know, busy work. And from the very beginning, this set the tone. Humans exist to work, the gods exist to be unpredictable. One of the most important figures in Sumerian mythology is Anu, the sky god. He's distant, removed, not especially involved, which already tells you something. Then there's Enlil, god of wind and storms, authority, disaster. Enlil is powerful, impulsive, and frequently annoyed by humanity. At one point, humans become too noisy, too loud, so Enlil decides to wipe them out with a flood, not because they're evil, but because they're irritating. This is the Sumerian version of the flood myth, and yes, it predates the biblical one. One man is warned, Ziusudra. He builds a boat, survives. But here's the key difference. After the flood, the gods don't feel guilty. They don't promise never to do it again. They just move on, which is very on brand. Then there's Inanna, goddess of love, fertility, war, and chaos. Inanna is complex, contradictory, emotionally volatile. She falls in love, she starts wars, she throws tantrums. She's one of the most vivid personalities in ancient mythology, and she also represents instability, change, transition, the collapse of old orders. Her most famous myth is her descent into the underworld. She goes down, she dies, she is stripped of power, she comes back changed. It's not a happy story, it's a cyclical one. Death, return, loss. And late Sumerians loved this story because it reflected their reality. Another major text is the Lamentations. These are poems mourning the destruction of cities, and they are devastatingly calm. No screaming, no rage, just grief. Cities are described as abandoned, temples as silent, gods as having left, not because the people failed, but because the gods decided to leave, which removes blame and adds inevitability. The lamentation for Or is especially haunting. It describes the city after its fall, empty streets, broken walls, and the tone isn't shock, it's resignation, like everyone saw this coming, and maybe they did. The Epic of Gilgamesh also fits here. Gilgamesh is a king, powerful, arrogant. He loses his friend Enkidu, and then he panics. Not about politics, not about legacy, about death. He searches for immortality, fails, and in the end, he returns home, wiser, quieter. The message is clear. You will die. Your city will fall. Enjoy the walls while they're standing. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. And for a civilization watching itself fade, that kind of worldview makes sense. The Sumerians didn't expect salvation, they expected continuity through storytelling, and that's what they achieved. Because even as their language disappeared from daily use, their stories didn't. They were copied by Akkadian scribes, then Babylonian ones, each generation slightly adjusting details but keeping the core. And that's how the Sumerians survived, not as a people, but as an influence, which is a very quiet kind of immortality. So, as we drift onward, remember this. The Sumerians didn't ask, how do we stop the end? They asked, how do we understand it? And then they wrote it down. In the next part, we'll gently explore how later civilizations remembered the Sumerians as ancestors, as teachers, as ghosts in the foundations of their cities. Just let the story settle. We'll keep drifting. All right. Still here, still drifting. If your thoughts are starting to wander, that's perfect. That's exactly where the Sumerians like to live now. somewhere between memory and background noise. Because at this stage, the Sumerians aren't really participants in history anymore, they're references. They've become the old ones, the ancient authorities, the people everyone claims to respect while quietly doing things their own way. And that transition is fascinatingly gentle. After the fall of Ur, Mesopotamia doesn't empty out, it reorganizes. New dynasties rise. Amorite kings take power. Babylon becomes important. And these new rulers do something very telling. They don't erase the Sumerians. They inherit them. Sumerian temples are restored. Sumerian gods are honored. Sumerian language is preserved in schools, but only in very specific contexts. Sumerian becomes a classical language, which means no one speaks it at home anymore. It's used for rituals, for royal inscriptions, for formal hymns, like Latin in medieval Europe. You don't argue with your spouse in Latin. You use it to sound authoritative. And that's exactly how later Mesopotamians treated Sumerian. It sounded ancient, serious, connected to divine order, which made it perfect for kings trying to legitimize themselves. Babylonian rulers loved to claim continuity. They weren't just kings, they were heirs. Heirs to Sumerian wisdom, Sumerian law, Sumerian tradition. Even Hammurabi, famous for his law code, leaned heavily on earlier Sumerian legal concepts. He didn't invent order, he repackaged it, which is the most respectful form of copying. Scribes continued to train using Sumerian texts. They copied myths, proverbs, hymns, sometimes without fully understanding the language. There are tablets where scribes clearly struggled. Misspellings, awkward translations, glosses explaining archaic words. It's like watching students memorize a dead language for an exam they don't emotionally connect to, which, again, is timeless. But through this process, Sumerian ideas stayed alive. The concept of kingship as divinely sanctioned, the structure of temples as economic centers, the pessimistic worldview. Even the bureaucratic obsession survived. Babylonian administration was every bit as paperwork heavy, because once you invent bureaucracy, it never truly dies. It just changes fonts. What's especially interesting is how later Mesopotamians talked about the Sumerians. They treated them as semi-mythical, wise, ancient, almost superhuman. Which is ironic because the actual Sumerians were stressed farmers and exhausted scribes who complained constantly. But that's how memory works. We turn our predecessors into singles. The messy parts fade, the accomplishments remain. And the Sumerians had accomplishments to spare. They invented writing, cities, formal law, schools. They figured out how to live together at scale, which is still something we're arguing about. Even their failures became lessons: environmental mismanagement, over-centralization, dependency on fragile systems. Later civilizations repeated these mistakes anyway, because humans are very good at remembering ideas and very bad at remembering consequences. By the time Assyria rises, Sumer is already ancient history. Assyrian kings reference it like a foundation myth. They don't see Sumer as a fallen civilization. They see it as a beginning. And that's the quiet trick the Sumerians pulled. They didn't need to survive politically. They survived conceptually. Every time a king issued a decree, every time a scribe picked up a stylus, every time a city planned its walls and canals, that was Sumerian DNA at work, which means their end wasn't really an end. It was a diffusion. Their identity dissolved into the broader current of Mesopotamian civilization, and eventually into ours. Because the idea of history itself, writing things down so they aren't forgotten, that was their gift. And it worked. Even now, we're talking about them, quietly, calmly, thousands of years later. In the next part, we'll linger on the physical remains, the ruins, the abandoned streets, the cities slowly sinking back into the earth, because even silence leaves traces. Just rest here for a moment. Let the ancestors fade gently into the background. We'll keep going.
All right. Still drifting. Still very quiet. Let's walk, slowly, through the places the Sumerians left behind. Not while they were loud and crowded, but after, when the people were gone and the wind took over. Because Sumerian cities didn't get dramatically obliterated. They weren't reduced to cinematic rubble in a single afternoon. They were abandoned in stages. And that might be the most peaceful ending a city can have. Take Ur. At its height, Ur was busy. Temples humming with activity, warehouses full, streets packed with merchants, priests, scribes, children running around barefoot. Then the system faltered. Grain shipments slowed, officials stopped showing up, families left to find better land, and Ur didn't fight it. No barricades, no final stand. People simply stopped coming back. Mud brick buildings, without constant maintenance, don't age gracefully. Rain melts them. Wind rounds the corners. Roofs sag. Walls soften. Doorways slowly blur back into the earth. Within a generation or two, entire neighborhoods become gentle mounds, which is why Mesopotamian ruins look like hills. They're not hills. They're cities that laid down. Uruk followed a similar path. Once one of the largest cities in the world, possibly the first true megacity. By the time later empires rose, Uruk was already ancient, still inhabited, still respected, but no longer central. Its temples were repaired again and again by new rulers, each generation patching old bricks with new ones, until eventually, even that stopped. The ziggurats remained the longest. Massive, heavy, too stubborn to fully disappear. They eroded slowly, step by step, layer by layer. And what's strange is that no one seemed to mourn the cities in real time. They became part of the landscape. People lived nearby, used the ruins for building materials, built new homes using old bricks, which feels oddly practical. Why waste a good clay? This reuse is another reason the Sumerians faded so quietly. Their remains were never sealed away. They were absorbed. A wall becomes a foundation. A temple brick becomes part of a house. A city becomes farmland. And eventually, people forget what was underneath their feet. Centuries pass. Empires rise and fall on top of these old cities. Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, each one building, conquering, administering, each one unknowingly living on layers of Sumerian history. And because the ruins were mud brick, not stone, they didn't scream for attention. They whispered. It wasn't until the modern era that anyone really started paying attention again. European explorers, archaeologists, people with notebooks and very strong opinions. They saw these mounds and thought, that's weird. And then they dug. What they found wasn't treasure in the usual sense. No gold hoards, no dramatic tombs, just tablets. Thousands of tablets. Receipts, letters, prayers, complaints.
which is exactly what you'd expect from the people who invented writing to manage their stress. And slowly, the Sumerians came back into focus, not as legends, but as people. Annoying people, tired people, people who worried about grain deliveries and bad handwriting. The ruins told the same story as the texts. No sudden stop, just gradual abandonment. And that's what makes the Sumerian end so unsettling. There's no moment to point to, no year you can circle and say, here, this is when it ended. Because it didn't. It thinned out. And that's a pattern we see over and over in history. Civilizations don't always fall. Sometimes they just stop being necessary, and the land moves on. So as we drift into the next part, keep that image in your mind. A city becoming a hill, a street becoming soil, a civilization becoming background. Next, we'll gently zoom out. We'll look at why the Sumerians ended this way instead of dramatically. Because their quiet ending wasn't an accident. It was the result of how they built everything in the first place. Just breathe. Let the dust settle. We'll continue.
All right, still here, still floating somewhere between ancient rivers and a comfortable pillow. Now let's zoom out a little, not abruptly, just enough to see the shape of things. Because the quiet end of the Sumerians wasn't random. It was baked into the system from the start. When the Sumerians invented civilization, they made some very specific choices, and those choices determined how everything would eventually unwind. First, location. Southern Mesopotamia was not forgiving land. No natural defenses, no consistent rainfall. Everything depended on human effort. Canals had to be dug, maintained, constantly repaired, which meant cooperation, lots of it. Early on, this was manageable. Small communities, shared labor. But as cities grew, cooperation became administration, and administration became bureaucracy. The Sumerians leaned hard into centralization. Temples and palaces controlled land, controlled labor, controlled surplus, which worked beautifully as long as everything worked. But when things went wrong, climate shifts, soil salinization, political instability, the system had no flexibility. It didn't snap, it stiffened, like an old joint. Grain still had to be recorded, rations still had to be distributed, even when there wasn't enough to go around. So instead of dramatic collapse, you get inefficiency, delays, corruption, a slow bleed. Second, worldview. The Sumerians did not believe history was going anywhere. No progress narrative, no destiny, just cycles, floods, rebuilding, decline. So when decline came, it wasn't shocking, it was expected. That expectation matters. Cultures that expect apocalypse often get one. Cultures that expect decay tend to drift. Third, identity. Sumerian identity was tied to cities, not ethnicity. If you lived in Ur, you were of Ur. If Ur declined, you left. No homeland to defend at all costs, no singular Sumerian nation to preserve, which made assimilation easy. You move to a new city, you adopt new customs, life goes on. And that's exactly what happened. Finally, writing. Writing preserved memory, but it also froze tradition. When language stopped evolving naturally, it became formalized. And once something becomes formal, it stops being alive. Sumerians survived as text, not as speech, which is a strange kind of survival. Impressive, but static. So when Akkadian replaced Sumerian as a spoken language, it didn't feel like loss. It felt like practicality. People followed what worked, and writing let them keep the past without living in it.
All of this led to an ending that wasn't violent. It was administrative, which might be the most Sumerian thing possible. Their legacy wasn't ruins, it was structure, and structures can be reused. So other cultures reused them, modified them, built on them, and in doing so, they buried the Sumerians gently, not out of disrespect, but out of efficiency. So when we talk about the end of Sumer, we're really talking about a transition from invention to inheritance, from originators to ancestors. And that's why the Sumerians feel so distant, not because they're forgotten, but because they're everywhere. Their ideas are so foundational we don't notice them. Cities, laws, contracts, schools, these aren't Roman inventions, they're Sumerian ones. And maybe that's the quietest ending of all, to disappear because your ideas became normal. In the next part, we'll slowly compare the Sumerians to other civilizations that ended loudly to see what makes silence different. Just stay comfortable, let the thoughts settle. We're almost there. All right, still drifting, still very calm. Now let's do something gentle and comparative. Nothing exciting, just a soft contrast. Because the Sumerians are strange not because they ended, but because they didn't announce it. So let's float past a few other civilizations, just briefly, like looking out a train window without getting off. Take the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, multiple civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean fell apart almost simultaneously. Mycenaeans, Hittites, cities burned, trade networks snapped. It's dramatic. Charred layers, weapons in the rubble. Archaeologists love this stuff. There are clear before and after layers. The Sumerians don't give us that. No fire line, no sudden silence, just thinner records, shorter inscriptions, more complaints. Then there's Rome. Rome fell loudly in the imagination, even if the reality was slower. Barbarians, emperors, very theatrical decadence. People felt Rome ending. They wrote about it. They mourned it. The Sumerians didn't really mourn Sumer. They mourned cities, temples, specific places, not the civilization as a whole. Because to them, Sumer wasn't an abstract idea. It was just life. Egypt is another interesting contrast. Egypt had a strong sense of continuity. Pharaohs, afterlife, monumental stone architecture. Even when Egypt declined, it kept calling itself Egypt. Same gods, same language for a very long time. The Sumerians didn't build in stone. They built in clay, which is humble, temporary. And that choice shaped memory. Stone All right, still drifting, still very calm. Now let's do something gentle and comparative. Nothing exciting, just a soft contrast. Because the Sumerians are strange not because they ended, but because they didn't announce it. So let's float past a few other civilizations, just briefly, like looking out a train window without getting off. Take the Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, multiple civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean fell apart almost simultaneously. Mycenaeans, Hittites, cities burned, trade networks snapped. It's dramatic. Charred layers, weapons in the rubble. Archaeologists love this stuff. There are clear before and after layers. The Sumerians don't give us that. No fire line, no sudden silence, just thinner records, shorter inscriptions, more complaints. Then there's Rome. Rome fell loudly in the imagination, even if the reality was slower. Barbarians, emperors, very theatrical decadence. People felt Rome ending. They wrote about it. They mourned it. The Sumerians didn't really mourn Sumer. They mourned cities, temples, specific places, not the civilization as a whole. Because to them, Sumer wasn't an abstract idea. It was just life. Egypt is another interesting contrast. Egypt had a strong sense of continuity. Pharaohs, afterlife, monumental stone architecture. Even when Egypt declined, it kept calling itself Egypt. Same gods, same language for a very long time. The Sumerians didn't build in stone. They built in clay, which is humble, temporary. And that choice shaped memory. Stone demands remembrance. Clay accepts erosion. So when Egypt fell, it left monuments that forced future generations to notice. When Sumer faded, it left paperwork, which is less dramatic, but more honest. And then there's the Maya. Cities abandoned, causes debated. But again, there's a sense of mystery, of suddenness. The Sumerians offer no mystery. We know exactly what went wrong. Environmental stress, over-centralization, political fragmentation. It's almost boring, which might be why it feels so modern. Because this isn't a story about collapse. It's a story about systems aging. And aging doesn't scream. It sighs. The Sumerians also lacked a strong narrative of exceptionalism. They didn't think they were chosen. They didn't think they were eternal. They thought they were temporary caretakers. That mindset matters. If you believe your civilization is fragile, you don't fight its decline with desperation. You adapt. You merge. You move. And that's what they did. So when Akkadian became dominant, it wasn't cultural erasure. It was practicality. When new gods arrived, they weren't threats. They were additions. When kings changed, titles stayed, which made the transition smooth. Too smooth to notice. And that's why historians struggle with Sumer's end. There's nothing to point at. No villain, no final act, just continuity wearing a different name. And maybe that's the most unsettling comparison of all. Because loud collapses feel distant. Quiet ones feel familiar. They look like slow budget cuts, deferred maintenance, languages slipping out of daily use. They look like what happens when systems keep running, just not as well. And suddenly, centuries later, someone looks back and says, "Oh, that's when it ended." But no one at the time felt that moment. So as we drift onward, let that sit. The Sumerians didn't fail spectacularly. They just became unnecessary. And next we'll turn inward again, back to the human side, the emotions, the exhaustion, the sense that things were heavier than they used to be. Because even quiet endings are felt. They're just felt slowly. Stay comfortable. We'll keep going. All right. Still drifting, still very quiet. This is the part where everything feels heavier. Not dramatic, just worn down. Because even if the Sumerians didn't mark their own ending, they felt it. You can sense it in the tone of the texts, in the complaints, in the prayers that sound less hopeful and more exhausted. This is not a civilization panicking. It's a civilization yawning. Let's linger there for a bit. Late Sumerian records are full of administrative friction, officials asking for clarification, governors sending excuses, delays blamed on weather, bandits, or missing donkeys. Always the donkeys. There's a constant low-level frustration in these documents. Nothing works as smoothly as it used to. Rations are late. Work crews don't show up. Supplies vanish between warehouse and destination. And no one seems shocked, just annoyed. Which tells you this wasn't sudden. It was normalized dysfunction. Kings issued decrees reminding people to do their jobs, which is never a sign of peak performance. Local officials start acting independently, not rebelliously, just pragmatically. If the capital can't help us, we'll handle it ourselves. That mindset spreads, and once it does, central authority becomes symbolic. Still respected, still referenced, but no longer essential. Religion reflects this fatigue too. Prayers become more personal, less confident. People ask gods what they did wrong, not angrily, just confused. There's a recurring theme of injustice. Why does the wicked prosper? Why does the good suffer? These aren't revolutionary questions, they're weary ones. And when a society starts asking them repeatedly, it's usually because the social contract feels shaky. The gods, in response, remain silent. Or worse, they're blamed for leaving. There are texts that describe gods abandoning cities, not punishing them, leaving them, which is emotionally different. Punishment implies attention. Abandonment implies indifference. That's a hard thing to sit with. And people did. They adjusted. They prayed to new gods. They adopted new rituals, not out of betrayal, out of hope that maybe someone was still listening. Daily life reflects this quiet adaptation. Households shrink. Extended families break apart as people migrate. Young men leave to find work elsewhere. Elders stay behind, maintaining traditions that fewer people participate in. That generational gap matters. It's how cultures thin. And still, no riots, no mass despair, just coping. People laugh, they marry, they complain about taxes. They always complain about taxes. Even as the idea of Sumer fades, the routines remain. Which is probably why the ending felt invisible, because life didn't stop. It just slowly changed shape. And that's deeply human. We tend to notice catastrophe. We're bad at noticing erosion. The Sumerians eroded, emotionally, administratively, culturally, and erosion doesn't come with a date stamp. So if you imagine someone in late sitting in a courtyard at dusk, they don't think, this is the end. They think, I'm tired. And that feeling, that low ambient tiredness, that's often how big things end. Not with fear, but with fatigue. In the next part, we'll let ourselves drift even further forward in time. We'll look at how modern historians slowly reconstructed the Sumerians from fragments, because in a strange way, their quiet ending made their rediscovery just as slow and just as patient. Stay relaxed. Let the thoughts soften. We're still going. All right, still with me? Still drifting somewhere between ancient clay and modern paperwork? Now we gently slide forward in time, not all the way to us just yet, just to the point where the Sumerians are no longer living memories, but buried ones. Because the way the Sumerians ended is exactly the way they were rediscovered, quietly. accidentally, with no one quite realizing what they were looking at. For a long time, no one knew the Sumerians existed, not as a distinct civilization. The Bible mentioned places like Ur. Classical authors talked vaguely about Mesopotamia, but the Sumerians themselves? Gone. Their cities were just mounds, low, unremarkable rises in the landscape. Locals lived near them, farmed around them, sometimes dug into them for bricks. They had names, of course, but no one thought, this is the first civilization. It was just land. Then, in the 18th and 19th centuries, European travelers started poking around, which is how archaeology often begins, with curiosity and imperial ambition, and a lot of wrong assumptions. They saw these mounds and thought they might be biblical cities, Nineveh, Babylon, so they dug. At first, what they found was confusing. Clay tablets, thousands of them, covered in wedge-shaped marks. Cuneiform. But here's the thing. Cuneiform wasn't one language. It was a writing system, and the earliest tablets weren't in Akkadian. They were in something else, something older, something no one could read yet. Scholars argued. Some thought it was just a weird dialect. Others thought it was ceremonial nonsense. Eventually, someone noticed something important. This language didn't behave like Semitic languages. Different grammar, different structure. It wasn't related, which meant Mesopotamian civilization had roots deeper than anyone realized. And slowly, very slowly, the Sumerians emerged, not through monuments, but through records, lists of sheep, ration accounts, school exercises, the least glamorous documents imaginable. And yet, these were the most revealing. They showed daily life. They showed administration. They showed stress. They showed a civilization that didn't vanish in flames. It just stopped talking. Decipherment took decades. Scholars argued over signs. Meaning shifted. Translations changed. Even now, Sumerian isn't perfectly understood, which feels appropriate. They remain slightly out of reach. But what emerged was not a mythic people, not god kings or heroes, just people. Annoyed scribes, anxious kings, tired farmers. A civilization that invented complexity and then lived inside it until it wore them down. And modern historians, reading these tablets, felt something familiar. Because the Sumerians didn't sound ancient in the dramatic sense. They sounded human, which made their ending even quieter. There was no grand final tablet saying, "We are done now." Just fewer tablets, then none. So when historians talk about the end of Sumer, they're really talking about a gap, a silence. And silence is hard to interpret. Was it conquest? Climate? Economics? The answer, inconveniently, is yes, all of it, over time. No single cause, no single moment, which frustrates people who like clean narratives. But history rarely offers those, and the Sumerians least of all. They invented history, but they didn't dramatize it. They recorded it, which means their ending feels less like a story and more like a file that was quietly closed. So as we keep drifting, remember this. The Sumerians didn't disappear. They stopped writing new entries, and everything else continued. In the next part, we'll start easing toward the long, slow echo of Sumerian ideas in the modern world. Not loudly, just enough to notice they're still there. Stay comfortable. We're not done yet. All right, let's keep going. Slowly, comfortably. This is one of those stretches where nothing urgent happens, which is perfect, because what comes after the end of the Sumerians isn't an aftermath, it's an echo. And echoes don't rush. They just linger. By the time the Sumerians are gone as a living culture, their ideas are already everywhere, so embedded that no one questions them anymore. Writing? Normal. Cities organized around temples and administration? Normal. Kings issuing laws and claiming divine approval? Completely expected. All of this felt natural to later Mesopotamians, but none of it was natural before Sumer. And that's the strange thing about foundational civilizations. They vanish not because they failed, but because they succeeded too well. Once your ideas become the default, your name stops mattering. Let's start with writing. Cuneiform didn't die with Sumer. It kept going for thousands of years. Different languages used it. Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian. Same wedge marks, different sounds. And for centuries, scribes trained the same way Sumerian scribes did. They sat in schools, they copied lists, they memorized signs whose original meanings were already forgotten. There's something deeply sleepy about that image. Generations of students bent over clay tablets, repeating exercises that originated in a world already ancient to them. Some of the earliest texts used for training were Sumerian proverbs, short, dry, practical. Things like, "Those who sleep too long will go hungry," which is not exactly inspirational, but very honest. These proverbs survived because they were useful, and usefulness is a kind of immortality. Law followed the same path. Sumerian law codes weren't dramatic. They weren't carved into massive stone pillars for show. They were practical guidelines: compensation, fines, property disputes. Later law codes borrowed heavily from this framework, not because anyone was nostalgic for Sumer, but because it worked. And that's how most cultural inheritance happens, not through reverence, through convenience. Religion, too, carried forward in quiet ways. Gods changed names, merged roles, absorbed traits. Inanna became Ishtar. Enlil's authority filtered into later storm gods. Even when worship styles changed, the emotional tone stayed similar. Mesopotamian religion remained cautious, anxious, transactional. You didn't love the gods, you managed them, which is a very Sumerian mindset, and it survived long after Sumer itself. Even the pessimism stuck around. The idea that humans are fragile, that life is uncertain, that death is unavoidable. This worldview runs through Mesopotamian literature for centuries, and it contrasts sharply with later traditions that emphasize salvation or progress. The Sumerians didn't promise hope, they offered realism, which might be why their stories feel oddly modern. Now let's talk about cities. Urban life itself is one of Sumer's longest echoes. Before Sumer, people lived in settlements, villages, loose clusters. Sumer created dense, organized urban spaces with zoning, with institutions, with social stratification. And once that model existed, it spread. Because cities are efficient. They concentrate labor, resources, ideas, but they also concentrate stress, which the Sumerians learned the hard way. Later civilizations inherited both sides of that equation, the prosperity and the burnout. And that pattern, rapid growth followed by administrative overload, repeats again and again in history. You could argue we're still living inside that experiment. Another echo is bureaucracy. The Sumerians were obsessed with tracking things: who owed what, who worked where, who received rations. It was necessary, but it also created distance between people and resources. Abstraction. Grain becomes a number, labor becomes a tablet entry, and once systems become abstract, they can ignore reality. That was one of Sumer's quiet problems, and it's a problem we still recognize instantly. When records say everything is fine, but everyone knows it isn't. That disconnect didn't end with Sumer, it multiplied. So when we talk about the Sumerians echoing into the modern world, we're not talking about direct influence. No one today says, "Ah, yes, as the Sumerians intended." It's subtler than that. It's the shape of systems, the assumptions baked into organization, the belief that writing things down creates order. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just creates the illusion of control, and that illusion is very old. The Sumerians were the first to live inside it, and the first to slowly realize its limits. Which brings us back to their ending, Because once you see their influence stretching forward like this, their disappearance feels less tragic. They didn't vanish, they dissolved into the structure of civilization itself, like salt in water. You don't see it anymore, but it's still there. And maybe that's why their end feels so quiet. They didn't need to be remembered as a people. They became a process, a way of organizing life. And processes don't get endings, they just get updated. So as we drift onward, deeper into the long aftermath, keep that thought close. The Sumerians didn't fail, they finished. They completed a phase and handed it off. In the next part, we'll gently consider what it might have felt like to be among the very last people who still knew they were Sumerian, not in a dramatic way, just in the small, private way identity fades. Stay relaxed. Let the echoes stretch out. We'll continue.
All right, let's keep going. Unhurried, very steady. Now we're going to slip into something even quieter. Not immense, not systems, identity. Because civilizations don't end when buildings fall. They end when people stop noticing they belong to something. And for the Sumerians, that moment probably came without ceremony. Imagine being born in southern Mesopotamia sometime after the fall of Ur. Your parents still use old Sumerian phrases at home. Your grandparents definitely do. But in the marketplace, Akkadian is more useful. Officials speak Akkadian. Traders speak Akkadian. So you learn both. Not because you're making a statement, because you want to function. At school, you learn to write Sumerian, not to speak it, which is already strange. You copy hymns in a language you don't use to argue, joke, or complain. It feels formal, distant, like something you're borrowing. And slowly, the gap widens. Your children hear Sumerian only in ritual contexts, from priests, from teachers, not from their parents when they're tired or upset. That's the key shift. Languages don't die when they stop being written. They die when they stop being emotional. And Sumerian crossed that line quietly. No one made a decision. No council declared Akkadian the official language of daily life. People just chose what worked, which is how identity fades. Names changed too. Older Sumerian names gave way to Akkadian ones, not suddenly, gradually. Maybe a child is named in Akkadian but given a Sumerian nickname by a grandmother. Then one day, even the nickname disappears, and no one notices. Religion followed the same pattern. You still recognize the old ads, but you pray to them less. New gods feel more responsive, more relevant. And since the Sumerian gods never promised consistency anyway, this doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels logical. The last Sumerians didn't think of themselves as the last. They thought of themselves as adaptable, which is usually considered a strength. But adaptation has a side effect. It erases edges, and identity is all edges. So what happens to those last Sumerians? They live normal lives. They marry, they work, they age. And when they die, they're buried the same way their ancestors were. No one marks the moment. There's no tablet that says, "This is the final Sumerian funeral," which makes sense. You don't know you're the last until you already are. And by then, it doesn't matter, because identity only exists while it's shared. Once it's private, it's memory. And once it's memory, it belongs to history. The Sumerians transitioned from lived culture to inherited culture, from habit to curriculum, from language to subject. And that's the most peaceful ending imaginable. No violence, no erasure, just the slow realization that the old words are harder to remember, and that the new ones come more easily. So as we drift toward the final stretch of this long, quiet story, take that in. The Sumerians didn't die. They stopped noticing themselves. And then, eventually, so did everyone else. In the next part, we'll settle into reflection, not dramatic conclusions, just the gentle understanding of why this ending feels so different. Stay comfortable. We're almost there.
All right, let's keep going. No rush, no need to sit up or refocus. This is the part where the story doesn't really do anything anymore. And that's kind of the point, because by now, the Sumerians are no longer actors in their own history, they're atmosphere. They exist as assumptions, as inherited habits, as things people do without knowing why. And that's a strange kind of afterlife. If you were living in Mesopotamia a few centuries after the last Sumerian kings, you wouldn't feel like anything had ended. Cities still existed, canals still needed maintenance, temples still demanded offerings. Life was recognizable. The rhythm stayed the same. Wake up, work, complain, eat, sleep. That rhythm didn't belong to Sumer anymore, but it had been shaped by Sumer. Which means the ending didn't feel like loss, it felt like continuity. And humans are very good at mistaking continuity for stability, even when the foundations are quietly shifting. Later Mesopotamian rulers never said, "We are replacing the Sumerians." They said, "We are restoring order." Everyone always claims restoration. No one wants to admit they're improvising. So new kings used old titles, performed old rituals, restored old temples. Sometimes they didn't even know what the rituals originally meant. They just knew they were supposed to do them, which again is deeply human. Traditions outlive understanding all the time. The scribes notice, though. They always do, because scribes are paid to notice inconsistencies. Late scribal texts show confusion, outdated signs, archaic grammar, annotations explaining words no one used anymore. At some point, learning Sumerian became an act of archaeology rather than fluency. You weren't joining a living tradition, you were maintaining a legacy. And that changes how things feel. It becomes less personal, more formal, like visiting a museum rather than a home. But museums still matter. They shape identity quietly, and Sumer shaped Mesopotamian identity long after it stopped shaping daily speech. Even political geography followed Sumerian patterns. City-states remained the basic unit of organization. Even empires ruled through cities rather than replacing them. That idea, that cities are the core of civilization, was Sumerian, and it stuck. When later empires collapsed, cities remained, damaged, reduced, but recognizable, just like Sumer had been. And maybe that's the most interesting part. Sumer didn't just experience a quiet ending, it taught the world how to end quietly, how to fade instead of explode, how to be absorbed rather than erased. That template repeated itself, again and again. You can see it in the late Roman world, in medieval cities built atop Roman ruins, in languages evolving until no one remembers the older form, in institutions changing names but not functions. This is the Sumerian way out. Not dramatic, not heroic, just practical, which might be the most unsettling lesson of all, because it means civilization doesn't need enemies to end. It just needs time and maintenance fatigue, and a few generations who choose convenience over continuity. Now let's slow even further. Imagine the land itself, southern Mesopotamia after Sumer. Fields still cultivated, canals still dug, but the soil is tired. Salts linger near the surface, yields drop. Farmers adapt. They switch crops, they move. They don't write essays about environmental collapse, they just adjust. And that adjustment looks, from a distance, like decline. But from the inside, it feels like survival. Which is why endings are so hard to identify in real time. They don't feel like endings, they feel like coping. And the Sumerians were very good at coping. They had to be. They lived in a land that punished complacency. So, when their civilization slowly dissolved, it wasn't because they failed to adapt, it was because they adapted too well. They merged, they blended, they let go of fixed identity, which is a survival strategy, just not one that preserves labels. So, if you're waiting for a final moment, a last Sumerian speaking the last Sumerian sentence, it probably never happened. More likely, someone said something half in Sumerian, half in Akkadian, and no one corrected them. And that was that. No marker, no memory, just transition. And this is where the story becomes deeply uncinematic, which is exactly why it's important. Because most of history looks like this: long stretches of quiet change, barely noticeable at the time, only obvious in hindsight. We draw lines later. People living through it never see them. They just live. So when we talk about the quiet end of the Sumerians, we're not really talking about disappearance. We're talking about diffusion, about becoming part of something larger, about giving up a name and keeping the habits. And in a strange way, that's a kind of success. Not a glorious one, not one that inspires statues, but one that works. So as we continue drifting toward the end of this very long, very calm journey, keep that with you. The Sumerians didn't lose, they dissolved, and dissolution is not the same thing as destruction. In the next part, we'll gently reflect on why modern people are so uncomfortable with endings like this, why we crave collapses, and why the Sumerians refuse to give us one. Just stay relaxed, let the thoughts stretch out. We're still floating.
All right. Still drifting, still very steady. If you've been listening for a while now, you might notice something strange. Nothing has really happened in a long time, and that's intentional. Because the Sumerians don't give us the emotional payoff we're trained to expect from history. There's no villain, no final siege, no last stand on a wall at sunset. And that makes people uncomfortable. Modern audiences like endings that are loud. They like causes and consequences. They like to point and say, this decision ruined everything. But the Sumerians don't work like that. Their ending doesn't reward judgment. There's no single mistake to condemn, which means there's no one to feel superior to. And that's probably why their story feels unsettling. We're used to history as warning, as morality tale. The Sumerians don't offer one. They offer a process. And processes are boring and familiar and very hard to turn into a neat lesson. So let's talk about why we crave collapse stories. Collapse feels clean. It gives us a sense of closure. Rome fell. The Maya collapsed. The Bronze Age ended. Those phrases make it feel like something finished. But most civilizations don't end like that. They thin out. They decentralize. They adapt. They stop calling themselves what they used to be. And we don't like that because it means endings are messy. It means we could be living in one right now and not know it. The Sumerians force us to sit with that possibility. They didn't wake up one day and say, this is the beginning of the end. They woke up and said, the canal needs repair. And then they did that for generations, until eventually someone else was doing it instead. Same canal, different language. So when modern historians ask, what caused the fall of Sumer, they're asking the wrong question. Nothing caused it. It happened. Slowly. Predictably. Without drama. Environmental stress didn't end Sumer. It stressed it. Political change didn't end Sumer. It absorbed it. Language shift didn't end Sumer. It replaced it. Each factor alone was manageable. Together, over time,
They change the shape of the world. And that's not collapse, that's aging, which is much harder to romanticize. Now let's consider how this makes people feel today. We like to imagine ourselves as different, more advanced, more aware. We think we'd notice. We think there'd be signs. But the Sumerians had signs too. They just interpreted them as inconvenience. Lower yields, corrupt officials, unresponsive gods. Those are not red flags. Those are normal complaints, which is what makes their story uncomfortable, because nothing about it feels alien. It feels familiar. And familiarity removes the safety distance we like to have with ancient history. The Sumerians aren't a warning about hubris. They're a reminder that complexity wears down, that systems accumulate friction, that maintenance matters more than conquest, and that civilizations don't need enemies to end. They just need time. So when we ask for a dramatic ending, what we're really asking for is reassurance. We want to believe we'd see it coming. We want to believe endings announce themselves. The Sumerians quietly tell us they don't. They whisper, "You'll be busy living." And that's the most unsettling thing they could have left behind, because it means history isn't something that happens to people, it's something people become part of. Now, let's soften that thought. This isn't pessimistic, it's grounding. The Sumerians didn't disappear in fear. They lived full lives. They adapted. They blended. Their children survived. Their ideas survived. Even their complaints survived. Which means their ending wasn't tragic. It was ordinary. And ordinary endings don't make good myths, but they make honest ones. So as we drift into the final stretch of this long monologue, let's let go of the idea that history needs a climax. The Sumerians don't give us one. They give us continuity. And in a strange way, that's more comforting, because it means even when names change, life continues, and people keep doing what people do, working, adapting, forgetting, remembering in fragments. In the next part, we'll gently close the circle, not with a conclusion, just with acceptance, because the quiet end of the Sumerians doesn't ask to be solved, it asks to be noticed. Stay comfortable. We're almost done drifting. All right, let's keep going, nice and slow. This part doesn't introduce anything new. It just lingers. Because if there's one thing the Sumerians understood instinctively, it was this: places remember longer than people do. Even when names change, even when languages shift, even when no one is consciously trying to remember. Southern Mesopotamia never forgot how to be Sumer. Not in a sentimental way, in a practical one. The rivers still flooded the same plains, the soil still demanded the same careful management, canals still needed to be dug, repaired, redirected. Anyone who lived there, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, had to learn the same lessons. Ignore the water, and it destroys you. Control it too aggressively, and it poisons the land. Balance is everything. That balance was the true Sumerian inheritance. Long after the language faded, the landscape kept teaching the same rules. Farmers who moved into old Sumerian territory didn't need ancient texts to tell them what to do. They learned by trial, error, and quiet frustration, which is how the Sumerians learned too. You could say the land trained them, and then trained everyone who came after. That's how memory works at a geological scale. The cities themselves, those low, unassuming mounds, never fully disappeared. They softened, they blurred, but they stayed. A traveler passing through might not know they were walking over Uruk or Lagash, but their feet followed the same contours. Their homes reused the same materials. The past became infrastructure, and infrastructure doesn't announce itself. It just works. Until it doesn't. Even today, archaeologists talk about Mesopotamia as a palimpsest, layers of occupation, one on top of another. Erase something, write over it, and traces still remain. That's Sumer in a sentence. Erased, written over, still there. There's something deeply calming about that. The idea that nothing truly vanishes, it just changes form. Sumerian temples became ruins. Those ruins became quarries. Those quarries became houses. And the houses became ruins again. Round and round. No finality, just reuse. Even the myths followed this pattern. Stories were retold, adapted, localized. Gilgamesh stopped being a Sumerian king and became a universal figure, a symbol of loss, of aging, of the realization that you don't get to keep everything, which again feels very Sumerian. Their worldview wasn't about triumph, it was about endurance. And endurance doesn't look impressive from the outside. It looks quiet, persistent, almost boring, but it lasts. So when we say the quiet end of the Sumerians, what we really mean is that they trusted the future enough not to fight it. They didn't freeze themselves in time. They didn't demand eternal recognition. They let themselves be used. Their land, their systems, their stories, and because of that, they stayed relevant far longer than louder civilizations ever do. There's a strange humility in that. The Sumerians didn't try to be unforgettable. They tried to make things work, and in doing so, they became unavoidable. So, if you imagine standing in southern Iraq today, the heat, the flat horizon, the rivers still cutting through the land, you're standing in a place that remembers, even if no one says the name Sumer out loud, even if the stories feel distant. The land remembers how to be a cradle of civilization because it's done it before, and it will quietly do it again. So, as we ease toward the very end of this long, drifting monologue, let this be the feeling that stays with you. Not loss, not collapse, but continuity so deep it doesn't need attention. The Sumerians didn't ask to be remembered, they just kept building, and long after they stopped, the world kept building on them, one brick at a time. We'll rest here for a moment. No conclusions, no final words, just a place that remembers, even when everyone else has moved on. All right, we can stay a little longer. No need to wrap anything up neatly. The Sumerians wouldn't have. This last stretch isn't really about history anymore. It's about perspective. The kind you only get when you stop expecting a story to end and let it keep moving without you. Because if you follow the rivers, and the Sumerians always did, you notice something important. The Tigris and Euphrates don't care who names them. They don't care who governs their banks. They don't care what language people shout at them when they flood. They just keep doing what they've always done. Overflow, recede, change course, undo human certainty. The Sumerians understood this better than anyone because they had no illusion of permanence. They didn't carve their history into mountains. They pressed it into wet clay. Temporary by design. Clay cracks, clay erodes, clay can be reused, which feels intentional in hindsight, like a civilization that never expected to be immortal. Their kings didn't build for eternity, they built to be maintained, and maintenance is a quiet act. It doesn't announce itself, It doesn't get remembered. It just keeps things going a little longer. And when maintenance stops, things don't explode. They soften. They sink. They return to the ground. That's what happened to Sumer. Not failure, not punishment. Entropy. The same thing that happens to everything that lasts long enough. And maybe that's why their story feels so calming. There's no moral tension, no sense that things could have gone differently if only someone had made a better decision. Because maybe they couldn't have. Maybe Sumer was always meant to be a beginning, not a destination. A proof of concept. Here's how cities work. Here's how writing works. Here's how administration works. Now take it from here. And humanity did. Messily, repeatedly, with varying degrees of success. The Sumerians didn't stay to supervise. They stepped back. Or rather, time stepped over them, and they didn't resist. Which is rare. Most civilizations cling. They double down. They monumentalize. They demand remembrance. Sumer didn't. It trusted continuity over recognition, which is a surprisingly mature choice for the world's first civilization. If you imagine the very last person who could speak Sumerian fluently, not a priest, not a scribe, just someone who used it naturally, they probably didn't know they were special. They probably didn't feel like a living relic. They were just talking about work, about weather, about whatever people talk about when nothing dramatic is happening. And then one day, they didn't. And the world didn't pause. Which sounds sad until you realize something. That's how life is supposed to work. No one gets a final scene. No one gets a closing monologue. Things continue because they're useful, not because they're named. And the Sumerians were useful, exceptionally so. They figured out how to live together at scale. They figured out how to remember things beyond a single lifetime. They figured out how to complain in writing, which might be the most human invention of all. And once those things existed, they couldn't be undone. So Sumer didn't need to survive as a culture. Its inventions already had. They were already independent, already traveling, already changing hands. And maybe that's why this story ends the way it does, not with a conclusion, but with a river. Still moving, still reshaping the land, still inviting people to try again. Different names, same problems, same solutions. And somewhere under the soil, under the canals, under the cities that came later, a few softened bricks, a few broken tablets, still there, not asking to be remembered, just existing. So we'll leave it like that. No summary, no lesson spelled out. Just a very old place that once tried something new, and then quietly let the future take it from there. You don't need to stay awake for this part. The river will keep flowing either way.
All right, we can keep drifting. This part sits in the silence after everything important has already happened, which is usually where history actually lives. Because once the Sumerians stopped being a people you could point to, the world didn't feel emptier. It felt quieter. Not empty, just less specific. The sharp edges of identity softened. Cities stopped insisting on ancestry and started insisting on efficiency. Who can manage the canal? Who can collect the grain? Who can keep the temple roof from collapsing? Practical questions. Always the practical ones that survive when grand narratives don't. And in that quiet, Sumer became something like background radiation. You couldn't see it, but it was everywhere. Every contract written in a cuneiform-inspired script, every legal code arranged in tidy lists, every king claiming divine favor but still worrying about taxes. That was Sumer talking long after its voice was gone. Which is an odd thing to think about when you're lying in the dark, listening to a calm voice talk about people who never imagined this future.
They didn't know we'd still say their city names. They didn't know their myths would outlive their gods. They didn't know their problems would look so familiar. But maybe they suspected something. Sumerian texts are not optimistic. They don't talk about progress. They don't talk about destiny. They talk about maintenance. They talk about things breaking, about people being unreliable, about the gods being moody and unhelpful. There's a weary tone to them, not despair, just realism. And realism ages well. So when later civilizations inherited Sumerian ideas, they also inherited that tone, that low-level assumption that things will go wrong, that systems need constant attention, that perfection is not on the menu. Which is comforting in a way. It lowers expectations, and lowered expectations are survivable expectations. Maybe that's why Sumer lasted as long as it did, and why it lingered even longer after it was gone. Because it didn't promise eternity. It promised function, and function can be copied. Now imagine the long stretch of time after the last Sumerian tablet was written. Years pass, decades, centuries. The land keeps being used. Someone digs a foundation trench and hits old brickwork. They reuse it. Someone finds a tablet fragment and uses it as filler. They don't read it. The past becomes material, not memory. Which sounds cold, but it's actually intimate. It means the past is physically present, built into walls, pressed into floors, not elevated, not separated, just part of life. And that's how Sumer finally rests. Not honored, not mourned, integrated. Which might be the best ending any civilization can hope for, because remembrance is fragile, use is durable. As long as people keep living in cities, Sumer isn't really gone. As long as people write things down to avoid arguing later, Sumer isn't really gone. As long as someone complains about officials and blames the system instead of themselves, Sumer is absolutely still here, just without the name. And names, as the Sumerians knew, are temporary. So we'll sit here a little longer, in the long quiet after the first voice learned how to write itself down. No drama, no closure, just a sense that something very old settled into the background and another really left. Stay relaxed. There's nothing you need to remember. History already has it covered.
All right, still here, still unhurried. By this point in the story, everything the Sumerians ever invented has stopped feeling impressive. And that's not disrespect. That's success. Because the true sign that something mattered is that it eventually becomes invisible. Writing stops being miraculous and becomes paperwork. Cities stop being experiments and become inconveniences. Laws stop being sacred declarations and become something you argue about. This is the phase where Sumer finally disappears from consciousness. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. Once everyone knows how to do a thing, no one remembers who did it first. They just assume it's normal. Of course you keep records. Of course you measure land. Of course you track debts. Why wouldn't you? And that's the quietest ending of all. When innovation becomes expectation, when invention becomes baseline. The Sumerians created systems meant to reduce chaos, and those systems spread because they were useful, not beautiful. They weren't elegant theories, they were clunky solutions to annoying problems. Who owes what? Who owns which field? Who's responsible when the canal collapses again? That kind of thinking doesn't inspire poetry, it inspires continuity, which is why Sumer never needed a revival. No one ever tried to bring back Sumer. There were no Sumerian revival movements, no nostalgia campaigns, because nothing was missing. Everything important had already been absorbed. People revived empires, they revived gods, they revived titles. But Sumer didn't need a revival. It was already embedded. And embedded things don't come back. They're already here.
If you look at later Mesopotamian kings, they still worried about legitimacy. They still performed rituals that made no practical sense. They still believed the gods cared deeply about city boundaries. Those anxieties were inherited. They weren't invented fresh, which means Sumer's psychological footprint lasted longer than its political one. And psychology is sticky. It doesn't leave easily. Even when belief systems change, habits remain. Which is why so many later cultures kept the same basic assumptions, that order is fragile, that nature must be managed carefully, that authority needs ritual reinforcement. Those are Sumerian ideas. They don't feel ancient because they're still active, and that's probably why the Sumerians feel strangely modern. Not in aesthetics, not in values, but in tone. They didn't believe history was a straight line upward. They believed it was something you had to constantly patch. That's a very contemporary feeling. So maybe the reason their ending feels quiet is because it never really ended. It just stopped being labeled. Like when a new generation stops using a word because everyone already understands the concept. The word disappears. The idea stays. That's Sumer. And if you listen closely, you can hear that same process happening all the time. Languages shedding grammar, customs shedding explanation, institutions shedding original purpose. Not because people are careless, but because familiarity breeds assumption, and assumption breeds silence. Which brings us back to the mood of this whole monologue. Quiet, unassuming, flat in the best way. That's the correct tone for Sumer. Because nothing about their ending demands attention, it just asks for patience. So we'll keep being patient. Let the thought stretch out. The first civilization doesn't need a finale. It already gave us everything it had to give. And then it stepped aside, which might be the most graceful exit in history. We'll rest here a moment longer. Nothing is happening, and that's exactly how it should be. All right, still with me, still no urgency. This part exists in that soft mental space where a civilization no longer has anything to prove. Sumer reached that point long before it stopped existing. Once you invent cities, writing, bureaucracy, law, and large-scale agriculture, there's really nowhere higher to climb conceptually. After that, it's all refinement, optimization, maintenance. And maintenance is not exciting. It doesn't generate legends, it generates schedules. The Sumerians figured this out early, which might explain why they never developed a heroic self-image. Their kings weren't conquerors of the world, they were managers, temple administrators with delusions of grandeur. And even their delusions were paperwork heavy. A Sumerian king's bragging rights usually involves things like rebuilding a wall correctly, restoring a canal that someone else neglected, pleasing the gods just enough to keep floods predictable. Not exactly cinematic, but deeply functional. So when later powers took over, they didn't overthrow a grand narrative, they inherited a to-do list, and they kept checking items off. Because once a system works, replacing it is more effort than using it. That's how Sumer survived without surviving. It became inertia. The weight of this is how things are done. Which is the strongest force in human history? Stronger than armies, stronger than ideology, stronger than ambition. Inertia doesn't need belief. It just needs habit. And habits don't die easily. Think about how many things you do every day without knowing why. That's civilization operating on Sumerian principles. You don't question the form, you question the inconvenience. And that's exactly how Sumer faded. Not challenged, not overthrown, just unquestioned. Its ideas stopped being discussed and started being assumed, which is the final stage of influence. So if you were alive in Mesopotamia centuries after Sumer, you wouldn't feel like you were living in the ruins of something great. You'd feel like you were living in a system that occasionally annoyed you. Taxes too high, officials inefficient, rituals tedious. which means Sumer had already succeeded, because the best systems are invisible until they malfunction, and Sumer's systems mostly worked. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but well enough that no one felt the need to reinvent them. And reinvention is usually how civilizations announce themselves. Sumer didn't announce itself. It just became default. That's why its ending feels anticlimactic. There was no moment where people stopped believing in it. They just stopped noticing it. And once something becomes unnoticeable, it's effectively immortal, because it no longer depends on attention. It just persists. So as we move toward the very end of this long, gentle drift, let's sit with that idea that the first civilization didn't burn out, it stabilized. And stabilization looks boring from the outside, but from the inside, it feels like relief, like nothing urgent needs to happen, and urgency is exhausting. Sumer removed urgency from large-scale human organization. It made life predictable enough to complain about, and that's a remarkable achievement. So we'll stay here, in a world where nothing dramatic is happening, where the most important things already happened a long time ago. And now, people are just living with the consequences, which is quietly how history actually works. All right, we can let this slow all the way down now. By this point, the Sumerians aren't even a subject anymore. They're a condition, a background state of human life that no longer requires explanation. And that's probably the most restful place any civilization can end up, because there's no demand attached to it, no lesson you're supposed to extract, no warning you're meant to internalize, no urgency hiding between the lines. Just a long acknowledgement that something began and then blended into everything that followed. The Sumerians don't ask to be admired. They don't ask to be mourned. They don't even ask to be remembered properly. They already knew how unreliable memory is. They invented writing because memory failed, which is ironic considering how their own memory dissolved so gently. But maybe they expected that too. Sumerian texts are full of quiet resignation about the gods being inconsistent, about life being unfair, about effort not guaranteeing reward. They never promised permanence. They promised structure. And structure doesn't care who built it. It just cares that someone keeps using it. So when Sumer stopped being used as an identity, it didn't panic. It had already offloaded its purpose into the world. Other people picked it up. Other languages named it differently. Other kings took credit. And Sumer didn't object, because civilizations don't have egos. People do. And the people who built Sumer were long gone by the time its influence peaked, which is another strangely calming thought. Your work doesn't belong to you for very long. It belongs to whoever finds it useful next. That's not tragic. That's just how continuity works. And continuity is quieter than legacy. Legacy wants applause. Continuity just wants to function. Sumer chose function over glory, over spectacle, over being remembered as special. Which might be why it still feels close. It doesn't feel mythologized beyond recognition. It feels practical, like something you could still use. And in many ways, we do. Every time a city argues over zoning, every time a contract exists, every time someone documents a transaction because trust isn't enough, that's Sumer still doing its job, without commentary, without branding, just quietly holding things together. So when people ask how the Sumerians ended, the most honest answer is this: they didn't. They just stopped being separate. And separation is a luxury of early stages. Eventually, everything merges. Ideas, practices, people. Names dissolve. Functions remain. That's not failure. That's absorption. And absorption is peaceful. So if you're listening to this as you fall asleep, let that be the final feeling. Not loss, not nostalgia, but a low, steady sense of continuity. Something old folding itself into something newer. No sharp edges, no final sentence. just a long, slow fade into normal life. The kind of ending that doesn't wake you up, the kind that lets you rest. Because the river is still flowing, and it doesn't need you to watch it.
All right, we're really in the quiet now. This is the stretch where history has stopped narrating itself altogether. No inscriptions, no official records trying to explain what's happening. Just life, continuing at a perfectly acceptable pace. By this point, if you lived in Mesopotamia, you wouldn't say you were living after Sumer reminder. You wouldn't say you were living because of it either. You'd just say you were living. The past doesn't feel like a separate place when it's fully integrated. It feels like the floor. You don't think about it unless it cracks. And for a long time, the Sumerian floor didn't crack. It sagged a little, it needed patching, but it held. So people stopped thinking about origins. They thought about weather, about harvests, about neighbors, which is exactly how Sumer became permanent, not as a story, as a default setting. That's why later empires could rise and fall on the same land without fundamentally changing how things worked. Assyria came through loudly. Babylon made itself memorable. Persia organized things on an impressive scale, but none of them erased the underlying logic. They built on it, they adjusted it, they complained about it, which means Sumer survived not by being admired, but by being unavoidable. And unavoidable things don't need narration. They don't need explanation. They don't need closure. They just exist. So if you're wondering why this ending keeps going without actually ending, that's intentional. Because the Sumerians didn't end. They slipped out of the spotlight and into the background. And background is where the most durable things live. Foreground gets remembered. Background gets used. And use is longevity. So now we're drifting past the point where history stops trying to teach us anything. There's no moral, no cyclical warning, no prophecy hiding in the clay. Just a gentle acknowledgement that some things are too foundational to feel dramatic, like gravity or language, or the idea that writing things down is usually a good idea. Those aren't exciting thoughts, but they're comforting ones. They remind you that not everything depends on attention, that not everything needs to be actively remembered to matter. Some things just keep holding the world together quietly, and Sumer was one of those things. So we'll let the narration thin out here, let the sentences slow, let the thoughts stretch, because there's nothing left to explain, only something to sit with, a very old silence, not empty, just full of things that no longer need words. Stay relaxed. Nothing important is about to happen, and that's the point.
All right, we can stay. There's no rule that says we have to leave once the story is done. And honestly, the Sumerians would approve of lingering. They were very good at lingering, at doing the same thing in the same place for a very long time without insisting that it meant something profound, which is refreshing. So let's stay here a bit longer, in the stretch of time where nothing historical is happening, but everything human still is. Picture a small Mesopotamian town, centuries after Sumer as a name has stopped mattering. There's a market. It's dusty. It smells like grain and sweat and river water. Someone is arguing over weights. Someone else is late with a delivery. A scribe is sitting nearby, bored, waiting to write something down. That scene could be Sumerian. It could be Babylonian. It could be later. It doesn't matter. Because the structure of the scene is Sumerian. The assumption that disputes should be recorded, that measures should be standardized, that someone official should witness the argument. Those assumptions are old, so old that no one remembers they were invented. An invention forgotten is the most complete form of success. Nobody wakes up grateful for bureaucracy, but everyone notices when it's gone. And Sumer made sure it stuck around, not because it was beautiful, but because it was useful. Which is why this ending doesn't feel like an ending. There's nothing missing, no gap, no absence, just a slow smoothing of identity until it disappears into routine. And routine is where humans spend most of their time. Not in turning points, not in collapses, but in repetition, day after day, fixing things that keep breaking in familiar ways. Sumer understood that early, that the future wasn't going to be heroic, it was going to be administrative. And that insight quietly shaped everything that followed. Even the way later people thought about gods carried Sumerian fatigue. Gods weren't distant ideals, they were administrators too. Moody, overworked, frequently dissatisfied. You didn't worship them for inspiration, you managed them. You gave offerings so they wouldn't interfere too much. That's not a religion of awe, that's a religion of coexistence. And coexistence is sustainable, which might explain why Sumerian religious attitudes lingered so stubbornly. They matched reality. Life wasn't about transcendence, it was about getting through the year without disaster. And that's still true. So if you zoom out far enough, Sumer doesn't feel ancient, it feels foundational, in the way plumbing is foundational. No one romanticizes it, but everyone relies on it. And when you're lying in bed, half asleep, listening to this kind of story, that's a comforting thought. That civilization wasn't built on drama, it was built on patience, on repetition, on people doing unglamorous work and then going home tired. The Sumerians did that first, not perfectly, not eternally, but long enough to teach everyone else how. And then they stepped aside, without ceremony, without bitterness. They didn't insist on being remembered correctly. They didn't leave instructions for how to honor them. They just left systems. And systems don't care about gratitude. They care about use, which is why they survive. So we'll stay here, in the afterglow of usefulness, where nothing needs to be defended, where no identity needs to be preserved, just a sense that something very old settled into the background and decided to keep working quietly. This is the kind of history that doesn't wake you up. It doesn't demand attention. It just hums, low, steady, unbothered, like a city at night. Lights on, people asleep, everything still running. We can sit with that hum for a while longer. There's no rush. Sumer waited thousands of years to fade. We can give it a few more minutes. All right. Still drifting. Still nowhere in particular. This part is about a feeling most people have, but almost never name. The feeling that you're standing on something very solid, that you didn't build and don't fully understand, but trust anyway. That feeling is Sumerian. Because once Sumer was gone as an identity, that's how everyone experienced it. No one thanked it. No one blamed it. They just assumed the ground would hold. And for a long time, it did. People woke up expecting markets to exist, expecting weights to mean something, expecting agreements to be remembered. Those expectations didn't come from nature. They were taught, slowly, over generations, until they felt natural, which is how culture becomes invisible. You don't feel it pressing down on you. You feel it supporting you. And that support only becomes noticeable when it fails. That's why Sumer doesn't get a dramatic ending, because nothing failed catastrophically. Things wore out. They were replaced. They were repurposed. Like a tool that gets handed down until no one remembers who made it. They just know how to use it. If you think about it, Sumer invented the idea that the past could be useful. not sacred, useful. Clay tablets weren't written to inspire. They were written so people wouldn't argue later. And that mindset shaped everything. History wasn't about honoring ancestors. It was about avoiding mistakes, which is a very practical way to think, not sentimental, just effective. So later societies inherited not just Sumer's systems, but its attitude, that the past exists to be referenced, not worshipped, that memory is functional, not emotional. And that's why Sumer didn't mind fading. It never asked to be admired, it asked to be consulted. And consultation doesn't require identity, it just requires continuity. So imagine someone centuries later digging a canal. They don't know it follows an ancient path. They don't know the slope was calculated thousands of years earlier. They just know it works, and they trust it. That trust is the real legacy. More than any king list, more than any myth. Trust that someone before you figured something out, and you don't need to reinvent it. That's a gift, a quiet one, but a powerful one. Because reinvention is exhausting, and Sumer saved humanity a lot of energy. Which is probably why this story feels so calm. There's no urgency left. Everything that needed to happen already did. The rest is just people using what's available, complaining about it, adjusting it slightly, and passing it on. So if you're still listening, half awake, let this part wash over you. The idea that you don't have to understand everything you rely on, that it's okay to stand on inherited structures, that continuity doesn't require awareness, it just requires participation. The Sumerians participated long enough to make the floor. Then they stepped back, and everyone else stepped onto it, without ceremony, without knowing their names. And that's fine. That's how foundations work. They don't ask for recognition, they just hold. So we'll stay here, standing on something very old, feeling its weight, feeling its stability, and not needing to think about it any further. Nothing is expected of you. The structure is already there. You can rest. All right, this is where we stop adding. Not because there's nothing left to say, but because saying more wouldn't change anything. And that feels appropriate. The Sumerians didn't end with a statement. They ended by becoming sufficient. They reached a point where what they had built didn't need commentary. It just needed use. So this final stretch isn't a conclusion. It's a release. The release of needing an ending that explains itself. If you've listened this far, you've probably noticed how little effort this story has made to impress you. That's intentional, because Sumer wasn't impressive in a loud way. It was impressive in the way a system still works long after no one remembers who designed it. That kind of success doesn't sparkle. It settles. And once it settles, you stop noticing it altogether, which is what happened. People stopped calling themselves Sumerian. They didn't stop doing Sumerian things. They still measured land, still recorded transactions, still worried about floods, still blamed authority when things went wrong. Those habits never went away. They just changed accents. And that's okay. Names are fragile. Practices are durable. So when we talk about the quiet end of the Sumerians, we're really talking about the moment they stopped needing to exist as a separate idea. They had already done their work. Everything else was redundancy. And redundancy is inefficient. The Sumerians would appreciate that. So we let them go. Not with sadness, not with reverence, just with acceptance. They don't need our attention anymore. They're already under everything. And if you're lying in the dark, letting this voice fade, that's fitting too. Because nothing dramatic is happening now. Nothing needs to be remembered actively. The past is doing what it always does best. holding things up quietly. So we'll leave it here. No summary, no moral, no final thought that ties it all together. Just the understanding that something very old did its job and then stepped out of the way. That's enough. You can rest now. The river is still flowing.